Every week, Hillsdale College President Larry P. Arnn joins Hugh Hewitt to discuss great books, great men, and great ideas. This is the Hillsdale Dialogues, part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. More episodes at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you find your audio. Also at the Hillsdale College Podcast Network, check out the Radio Free Hillsdale Hour, the Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education Podcast, The Larry P. Arnn Show, and more, all at podcast.hillsdale.edu.
Morning Glory, America. Bonjour, hi, Canada. I'm Hugh Hewitt inside the Beltway with Dr. Larry Arnn inside his study at Hillsdale College. All things Hillsdale are found at hillsdale.edu. And if you've been eagerly awaiting the 11th installment in our series on this book, Winston Churchill's The World Crisis, Volume 1, it is today. Some of you have become impatient with me because we often take detours from this, but they're all over at hughforhillsdale.com, and you can follow them. Dr. Arnn, somewhere in Bloomsbury Public or at Amazon, there's somebody's eyebrow goes, why are they selling all of a sudden Winston Churchill's The World Crisis when they've sold a couple of copies a year, but over the last year they've sold a lot of that? We're only at page, by the end of the day, 185 in a book of 400 pages, but it's wonderful. Everything is connected to everything. And last week you said that, and I am reminded of it in my first question today because I talked to you about the arrival of Lord Kirchner and Lord Lucas in the cabinet. And this is how things work. I had never heard of Lord Lucas before, and I'm sure you had. And I went and looked him up. And what an inspiring figure not to have heard of. He ended up, he's in the first beginning of the war cabinet as the Minister of Agriculture, which matters a lot if you got to feed a bunch of troops. And he ends up dead in aerial combat 3 years later. How do we not know about Lord Lucas, except for this book?
Well, he's, so the thing to know, the reason is he was killed early. And so he would have had a glittering career in politics, but he was killed in the war, which means he's a young man. Now, Churchill knows him because they were war correspondents together in South Africa. And, that was like my boys that I talked about a week or two ago about, let's strike out for India today and you pay for it and give us academic credit, right? Winston Churchill and Lord Lucas were the same kind of guy. About that, right? They're romping around, exposing themselves to gunfire, writing articles and making money. And Churchill was not at this time a soldier, which he had been a lot, because the army, under partly the impulse of Lord Kitchener, is how we say his name.
Okay, Kitchener.
Who was a big deal, very big deal, had been disgusted and angry at Winston Churchill's war correspondence, which he published in books, too. Big books that sold. Churchill was a much more prominent war correspondent than Lord Lucas because he was a heck of a writer. And people loved him, right? And he's a second lieutenant, and he's talking about the generals, and they don't like it. So they passed a regulation that you can't write for the press when you're in the army. So Churchill left the army. But he knew everybody in the army, right? And so Lucas and Kitchener showing up at the outset of the First World War, Lord Morley, Churchill tells the story that John Morley, the foreign minister, a great man that Churchill greatly admired, he didn't like the war and he didn't want to go into it. And he was such a great man, and he accepted that they were going to go, and he resigned from the cabinet. This is for young men, he says. And then these two men in their prime, Lord Lucas is still very young, as was Winston Churchill, they show up. And Churchill has old connections with both of them, with Lord Lucas because they were war correspondents together, And you know what writers are like. They're, first of all, terrible people, but they're, hanging out with each other. What about this? Do you write about this? What'd you find out about that? Right. And then Kitchener and Churchill have very old connections because they don't like each other. Because Churchill was this young man in a hurry, they say of him and such people. And he's an adventurer. And he goes and exposes himself to gunfire and does heroic things, genuinely heroic things on battlefields. And then he writes about them, modestly, by the way, about himself. And he becomes famous. And Kitchener doesn't like that. And so Churchill fought in Afghanistan, and he wrote a book about it, and the book was a big seller. And Churchill gets, come and see the prime minister of the country, and come and see the heir to the throne, the Prince of Wales, and tell me about your book. And in those conversations, when a young man goes into a great man, they say, anything we can do for you, young man? And Churchill says, I want to go with the force to fight in the Sudan. And so the heir to the throne and the existing prime minister, the serving prime minister, ask Lord Kitchener, can this young man go? And Lord Kitchener tells them both, no, he cannot go. And so Churchill just goes anyway. Everybody else is, I've got a photograph of it. There are published photographs of the horde of young officers hanging around outside the War Office, trying to find somebody important who will, walking out because he can't get in there, walking out to accost them and say, send me, Well,
because it's a very small army, and you have to fight to advance. And if you can't get to the Sudan, you're not going to have a career. It's like a young friend of mine who gave the Latin oration at his Harvard commencement, and he joined the Marines. And he spent 10 years in the Marines, and the moment that the first Gulf War came along, and he missed it. He was a general's aide in the Philippines, and he resigned his commission as soon as the war was over and said, I will have no career in the Marine Corps. Turns out he was wrong, but that's what young officers think. They think if they miss a war, they're done. And Churchill wasn't going to miss the war.
What he been to? Well, he never missed one, see. So what he did was, when he was you can't be more authoritatively turned down than the way Churchill was turned down.
Yes.
It's the most important task, and he says no. That's definitive. No. He just got in a carriage and went to the railway station and went to the coast and got on a ship and went to Alexandria. And he knew a lot of people in the army, and soon enough he caught on. And let me shut that up. I'm at home, by the way. I'm not going to be troubled to go anywhere special to do this. Anyway, home is really cool. Except you might hear my dogs barking too. So he gets there, and there's that great battle, and it's this battle, in my opinion, I have written this. The Battle of Omdurman, down by the Sudan, is forming of Churchill's understanding in a big way. Churchill is 24 years old, and he observes a cavalry charge by the dervishes, whom he did not like, but admired, across open ground against a prepared position. And the British just slaughtered them. And there's general rejoicing, but not Churchill. He thinks, good grief. Think what war has become.
There's another element to that, Dr. Arnn. We talked about it before. I want to refresh people because Lord Kitchener is involved. Churchill is dispatched by the head of his cavalry unit to deliver a message to the Lord. What do they call him? The Sirdar. Kitchener was the Sirdar. Yeah, Sirdar. And so he had to ride, and they actually connected. They met each other. And then they meet again in the cabinet, 20 years later? 15 years later?
Yeah. 1888 till 19. So it's 12 and 14. It's 26 years. And, and he's, they've had friction, right? because Kitchener doesn't like Churchill, and Churchill doesn't like Kitchener. And if you read the River War, the disposition of it, you might say, is that Kitchener's greatness as a general is that he was a wonderful logistical general. He built, the Nile's too narrow, too shallow, so you can't get heavy equipment down there, which is the reason they kept getting beat by this Mahdi of Allah, who formed the Islamic Republic in the Sudan. And so what he does is he puts gunboats on the river and other boats, takes railway equipment down to where it gets shallow. He builds a railway around the shallows. And then he puts the army in the gunboats, and then he takes them down to the deep place and launches them again, and now they got a modern army down by Khartoum today.
And when we come back, we're going to talk about the first address that the Lord gives his cabinet is about logistics. It's interesting. Don't go anywhere, America. Everything is connected to everything here on the Hillsdale Dialogues. Stay tuned. Welcome back, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt, talking with Dr. Larry Arnn, president of Hillsdale College, all things Hillsdale at hillsdale.edu, including another podcast that Dr. Arnn is a part of. It's called Conversations with Dr. Arnn with other people not named Hugh. And everything Hillsdale is found at hillsdale.edu. All of our conversations are found at hughforhillsdale.com. Dr. Arnn, I'm often arrested in the reading of this book, but at least as equally so by this paragraph in this chapter 11, The Passage of the Army. Both of these two men, that's Lord Kitchener and Lord Lucas, both of these two men were marked for death at the hands of the enemy. The young minister grappling with his adversary in the high air, the old field marshal choking in the ICC. I wonder what the 20 politicians round the table would have felt if they had been told that the prosaic British cabinet was itself to be decimated in the war they had just begun. Just declared. That's elegantly written. It's also arresting, and it makes you think, right? That doesn't happen in the modern cabinet anywhere in the world except by disaster. They're old men and women. They're not going to be out on the battlefield, and they're not going to cross in a passage that is dangerous, as Kitchener did, and was sunk by a submarine. But it's very, very arresting, and you wonder whether or not, by the time he gets to his death, Lord Kitchener, what he thought of Churchill, because as Churchill wrote, it was a case of dislike before first sight. And maybe Kitchener came to see him when he got fired, right? That's the one guy, maybe two guys went to see him?
One guy. Yeah. He was the only one. Churchill was then not to be touched, He had borne the blame for the Dardanelles. And see, here's a funny story that I know from Martin Gilbert, and I have to tell you, my source is Martin Gilbert saying it to me, which is very reliable, but not like he wrote it. Churchill is writing his report for the Dardanelles Commission of Inquiry, exhaustive look at things, better than we tend to do today. And Churchill was exonerated eventually in that report. But he was in a house, I've seen the house, just off Hyde Park on the south side, and Ian Hamilton was helping him write his report, and they hear a commotion outside, and he's writing a passage about Lord Kitchener, which is very critical. And they see that outside, the paper has come out, and everybody's buying one, that Lord Kitchener has died in the North Sea in a ship being mined. And so he has to change his testimony. He can't attack him so much now. And but they didn't, Lord Kitchener was the man who built the great British land army that fought in the First World War and that lost 900,000 people. And Churchill thought it may have been the only way to win the war, but he struggled constantly for another way because that way was a disaster. And the two ways that he sponsored were tanks and the Dardanelles. Go around.
Flanking.
Don't send young men across those trenches against artillery and machine guns, because That's the future of Britain that's dying there.
And it did change. Why do you think he spent so much time detailing the organization of the Admiralty? You know, the First Lord, the First Sea Lord, what the Second, Third, and Fourth Lords do, and how Jellicoe isn't. Why did he put that into a book?
Well, it was of greater interest back then than now, because the Navy was the thing. And his story, what he did, had a lot to do with that. Churchill was very good at running things. He knew how to do it. Like Lincoln turned out to be good at running things, but he didn't have the organizational knowledge. Lincoln carried papers in the top of his hat. If Churchill got in charge of a department, it was energized and transformed. And he turned the Admiralty upside down. He promoted younger ones. He changed their thinking about war, about naval war fighting, about how you win. And it's too bad, you know, the story of Winston Churchill's life is a glorious story and extremely instructive, in my opinion. But, of course, it's a story full of disappointment, as lives always are.
But he asks this question. He says, how then is a civilian minister appointed for political or parliamentary reasons and devoid of authoritative expert knowledge to acquit himself of his duty? And it's a question that you ought to ask before you appoint anyone to anything. It was good that he had served in the Army. It was good that he had known the Lord. It was good that he had been all over the world. But it's not necessarily dispositive that they'll be any good. And God knows we've got a lot of bad ministers in the United States government, both under Republicans and Democrats, because you don't know who will do it well.
Yeah, that's right. And it's hard. And we tend not to be, you know, everybody decries about the education of the young. But, you know, old people know less than they used to. And, you know, you can read about some American statesmen in earlier times, including in the early 20th century. And these are people who thought a lot and read a lot. Not as much.
They were better prepared. We'll be right back. Dr. Larry Arnn and Hillsdale College. The dialogue rolls along. Don't go anywhere. A long segment on the passage of the Army and why that mattered and why it was so dangerous. Stay tuned.
Would you turn down millions of dollars per year? All you'd have to do is surrender your independence and abandon your principles for the money. That's a devil's bargain. Sadly, it's one that almost all American colleges and universities make. But one college in America says no. Our college, Hillsdale College. Hillsdale College refuses to accept 1 penny of taxpayer money, not even indirectly in the form of federal student grants and loans. By saying no to taxpayer money, we remain genuinely independent, free to pursue our original 1844 mission, pursuing truth and defending liberty. Hillsdale has over 1,500 undergraduate and graduate students on its main campus in Michigan and its satellite campus in Washington, D.C. In addition, over 3 million citizens have enrolled in our free online courses, and over 6 million American households receive our free monthly publication Imprimis delivered in the mail. You can learn more about Hillsdale's independence from government, its mission of defending liberty, and its national educational outreach programs at hillsdale.edu/penny. That's hillsdale.edu/penny. Or, if it's more convenient, text the word penny to 71844, and we'll send you a link with more information on Hillsdale's independence. That's penny to 71844.
Welcome, America. Chapter 11 in the first volume of Winston Churchill's memoir of the First World War is titled The Passage of the Army. The bottom line is, page 184, all went well. Not a ship was sunk. Not a man was drowned. I think that's probably, if anyone knows anything about it, what they know. But boy, it was a tense affair, Dr. Arnn. This was not a given. And that's what I think Churchill wants to communicate to his readers 100 years later is this was a close-run thing, and we got it done. Not merely the passage of the British Army to the French mainland, but the passage of the French Army from colonial holdings in Africa to back to France so that they could hold the line against the Germans.
Yeah, even the people you call Steelers fans will understand this image. NFL teams frequently script the plays in the first series of downs that they have. And so what was the play of the British? And they had been working on it since Winston Churchill became First Lord of the Admiralty in 1911. And they did two things that were crazy. The first is they sent the fleet way up to the north off Scotland, as far away as you can be and be in roughly British waters from the North Sea, from the English Channel, where the threat will come. And the second thing is they sent basically the entire active British Army across the Channel to go join the French Army as a part of the French Army. And Churchill does not think that that's the great model of the way the British fight. They fight on the coast, moving their army around by sea. But no, they took the whole danged army, and that meant that the island was denuded of military force. And Churchill came to think in those 3 years that he was First Lord of the Admiralty that that was the way to win the war. And he did think later, my colleague Richard Langworth is after us to do the Battle of the Marne in detail, and we can if we want to. But you can also do it not in detail and just say that a counterattack led in part extensively by the British Army against the Germans, who got overextended to the north of Paris, is what stopped the German advance and caused the trenches to form. And if they hadn't been there, that probably would not have happened. And so they did, in fact, save the situation in 1914. It was a good judgment as far as it went. Now, the war itself was a victory, and in Churchill's reading, a disaster, but worse if they'd lost it.
What's interesting about this is that he also gets in the mind of Admiral von Tirpitz, about whom maybe people have heard the name, but they almost certainly have not read his war memoir, and he's Churchill's counterpart. But unlike Churchill, Churchill has executive authority over the Navy, and von Tirpitz doesn't have executive authority over the German Navy. And the German Navy did not leave port. And he writes at great length about how it was a moment of maximum danger for the British fleet, and not a single day went by that the German disadvantage grew and the British advantage increased during the entire war. So if Germany had flooded the Channel at that point, they would have lost a lot of their fleet, but they would have sunk a lot of the British Army, which wouldn't have been there for Mons and wouldn't have been there for the Marne. And the Germans blinked because Churchill scared them, or at least the concentration of the fleet at Scapa Flow scared them.
Yeah, they didn't know where they were. And see, the German fleet was very important in the war. They built this canal that united the North Sea and the Baltic, and that meant you never knew where they were going to be. Without that, then the Germans might very well have the British might very well have put a big force into the Baltic and exposed the German flank, which was what Churchill wanted to do, actually, before the Dardanelles. He wanted to use the Navy to open a new front, and his favorite for a while was the island of Borkum in the Baltic. But the point is, it was really hard to go there because whatever you sent through there, through the strait, the narrow place, between Sweden and Denmark.
The Blight, right?
Bridge. Yeah, there's a bridge across it now. It's not very wide. And if you send a bunch of ships through there, well, the Germans might show up with their whole fleet through the canal. Or they might take their whole fleet out into the North Sea and the English Channel. And so the German fleet was important in the war, although it didn't do anything except be there.
I want to go to the role of intelligence, because this matters in every war, including the one in Gaza and the one in Ukraine right now. the Germans, General von Kluck, who's commanding the 1st German Army in Belgium, receives from the Supreme Command no better information, Churchill says, than this. A landing of the British troops at Boulogne and their advance from Lille must be reckoned with. It is believed no landing of British troops on a big scale has yet taken place. Churchill dryly notes, 3 days later, the whole British Army was fighting the Battle of the Mons. And so the Germans had no idea where the Brits were or what they had done. And that is dispositive in at least the battle in front of you. And it still is to this day.
Yeah, and at this time, by the way, the reading of the opening of the war is that the Germans made mistakes. And the main mistake they made, has to do with Russia. Because Russia was very faithful in the opening of the war, and they went charging into Poland. And they went so fast and in such numbers that it frightened the Germans. And they took 2 army corps, each one of which is several divisions, which means, at a minimum 60,000 men each. And they shipped them off to the east to reinforce. And by the time they got to the east, the Russian army overextended itself and got itself destroyed. But and yet these battles, they weren't there for these battles to try to take Paris. Is what this great rightward movement through Belgium from Germany to go down. That's called the Schlieffen Plan, and the idea of it was to cut through and flank between the sea and the main force, the French army, and go down and take Paris and encircle the French army. And there's this old story about von Schlieffen, who wrote this plan in the late 19th century, that his dying words were, "Strengthen the right." Well, they weakened the right. And then they didn't know about how many British were there. Of course, they couldn't know for sure that they were even coming. And it was news that some had landed. How many? All of them? That was, because you see, there was a reason not to think that. Would they, in fact, denude the island of soldiers? Well, they did. And they did it again in 1940, and then it mattered a lot that they got a lot of them back at the Dunkirk invasion. But here in the First World War, they were not all destroyed, and the French army was never destroyed as it was in the Second World War. So they were there, and they went across, and that's the first set of plays that had been scripted. We're going to go. We're going to.
I also want to remind you, in this chapter, Lord Kirchner, am I saying it right now? Kirchner arrives in the cabinet. Kitchener. And he keeps, I'll never get it right. It's now transposed in my head, and I've got audio dyslexia. Lord Kitchener arrives, and the first thing he says is it's going to be a long time, and it's going to be a lot bloodier than you ever imagined. He's telling everyone who thinks it's going to be a short war, you're wrong. And on this, I think Churchill and he agreed. And nobody, that staggering number, 900,000 Brits. It's not the Germans, it's not the French, it's just 900,000 British young men die in this war. That's staggering, Dr. Arnn.
Oh, yeah. It's getting on for 3 times as many as in the Second World War. And Churchill was prime minister in the Second World War, and they were a lot more careful about that. Also, the war was of a different nature. Churchill was horrified by the way the First World War played out. And he struggled and risked his reputation, and for a time lost his reputation, trying to find another way. And Churchill's final criticism of Kitchener has 2 parts. He was critical of him as the kind of general he was over the war in Sudan, but he was critical of him in the First World War because, in the end, this character he had of a logistical general, he just set out to get all that manpower, to have it and use it to win that war of attrition. That's the first criticism. And, maybe he had to do it. That criticism is qualified from Churchill. But then the second thing was, in the attack on the Dardanelles, we'll get to that, he dithered a lot. And at first, no troops, then troops. That delayed things. And that too was a disaster. And, you'd have to say in a war, I like football because I like baseball because it's the sport least like war. And I like football because it's the most like war. And there was a game lately, a big game between Kansas City and Philadelphia. I didn't watch the game, but I read about it. One guy dropped a pass, and that
Kelsey.
changed the game.
Yep.
And that's that's how it is, right?
One bad decision. One bad decision. Stay tuned. We're going to talk about one very controversial decision you may not have heard of. Why didn't they sink the Goeben? And I'm sure I'll get it pronounced correctly for me when we return. Don't go anywhere. The last segment of this week's Hillsdale Dialogue next.
Hey there. Today I want to tell you about the Hillsdale K-12 Classical Education Podcast. This unique show explains how children benefit from an American classical education. Whether you're a teacher, student, or parent, you'll find something of value on the show. You'll hear from teachers and administrators from schools around the country, as well as Hillsdale professors and friends who are leading the effort to revive the American tradition of K-12 education. When you listen, you'll learn all about classical education, what it is, how to teach it, and why it matters today. And there are dozens of back episodes on specific topics, like teaching Singapore math, reading great books, and even understanding how athletics is critical to a child's development. Listen every Monday on podcast.hillsdale.edu. That's podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you find your audio.
Welcome back, America. I don't think I've been surprised by the Churchill first volume in the World Crisis, which Dr. Larry Arnn, president of Hillsdale College, and I have been talking. This is the 11th week, and there are more to come. By anything as much as the attention he gave to the Goeben. And I want you to explain to us, why does he give us the map? Why does this matter so much to him, Larry? It's one ship. They didn't get it, but they got all the French troops over from Africa. They got all the British troops over from the United Kingdom. Everything went well, except they didn't get the Goeben, and Churchill spends most of the time talking about that. And he gives us a map.
Yeah, well, that's because it illustrates, if you're interested in statesmanship, one of the great things about reading Churchill is he tells you how it works, and he's very good at explaining. Martin Gilbert, by the way, is also very good because he's strict about chronological order. He puts you in the place of the people who are deciding. And those people are just like us, you and me right now. Neither one of us has any idea what the devil we're going to talk about in 5 minutes because we never do seem to be able to know. You make an outline, we violate it.
True.
War is like that, right? So the Goeben is potentially disastrous, and they had to deal with it. And the Goeben ended up the flagship of the Turkish Navy, right? And there's probably it didn't affect it, but they're wondering what Turkey's going to do. And two things happen. One is Churchill, the British shipyards were building 2 battleships for the Turkish Navy, and Churchill seized them and didn't deliver them, right? At a time when they were concerned about whether the Turks would join the Germans or not. And all that trouble in the Middle East that comes later, my own opinion is it was bound to come eventually, but the occasion for it was Turkey's defeat in the First World War. So that's connected to that. Well, so is the Goeben, because then the Germans gave him a ship. And Ataturk, I think I said last time, was carried in state. Mustafa Kemal is the founder of modern Turkey. He was also the commander of the Turkish troops at the Dardanelles that the British army failed to dislodge, making a disaster in Winston Churchill's career. He was a heck of a general, at the time he was a colonel, I think, in the Turkish army. And so he's a very important man, and he founded modern Turkey, and he beat the British every time he fought them, including some battles just at the end, after the end of the First World War. But then he's carried in state in this Goeben that didn't get sunk. And so it's a very consequential ship, right? It's not the main line of history, but it shows you what you're doing all the time.
You know what else it illustrated to me is you've got to be careful how you write a command directive, because the commander of the Goeben cites a few phrases and a few messages from the Admiralty, and Churchill notes they are not without merit, although he wished he'd been clear and more dispositive in his direction, because a commander can find whatever they want to do if you send him too much stuff, Dr. Arnn. Have you found that to be true at Hillsdale? Got to keep your messages to the faculty brief?
Yeah, well, yes, but also you can't. You can believe in rules or you can believe in goals, and I believe in goals, not rules. First of all, in the middle of action, any piece of paper that long,
11 inches for those who are not watching, 11 inches long.
A full page of paper is too much, right? I always say you might be able to remember 3 things, not 5. Your man, Richard Nixon, always had a throwaway line. Anytime he started a list, giving a speech, you might forget. And so his throwaway line was, and lastly, there are no easy answers. Because
it's a good throwaway line.
Whereas what you can do is remember the objective. And Churchill was good at that, but, still, somebody on the scene is going to make a judgment. Are we going to try to sink this ship? Are we going to try to sink it just before war is declared? Because that's when they had the golden chance, and they didn't do it because they didn't want to open fire first until they had given warning. And that was decent and right. But the effect of it was the Goeben didn't do any damage. It probably was not the cause of Turkey joining the Germany. My colleague Richard Langworth tells us that he's talked to David Frumkin, who wrote a very good book about this that we've talked about. And Frumkin says the Turks had already made up their mind before both the seizure of the Turkish ships and the Goeben. But it wasn't dispositive, in other words. But it was important, and it shows what it's like to try to make decisions.
It's how to make a decision. That's why I thought that might be why it's in there. It's how to make a decision. Dr. Larry Arnn, thank you. The Hillsdale Dialogues will roll on. All things Hillsdale are at hillsdale.edu, including a completely separate set of podcasts with Dr. Arnn and distinguished visitors to the campus, which I recommend to you at hillsdale.edu. Stay tuned.
Thanks for listening to the Hillsdale Dialogues, part of the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. More episodes at podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you find your audio. For more information about Hillsdale College, head to hillsdale.edu.